Unplugged in, anger directed at U.S. troops pulling out of northern Syria, leaving Kurdish fighters who fought with America against ISIS on the run from Turkish bombing. Where does the decision to pull U.S. troops out of Syria leave Kurdish allies who fought and died alongside Americans?
The Kurds are very well protected, plus they know how to fight. And by the way, they're no angels. But
did the United States betray an ally? And is the dream of a Kurdish homeland still viable? Plugged In examines the Kurdish conundrum. On Kurds, the search for peace and stability. Hello and welcome to Plugged In. I'm Greta Van Susteren. The 5-day ceasefire negotiated by U.S. Vice President Mike Pence, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan to halt Turkey's assault into Kurdish-held territory in Syria has come and gone. But Kurdish fighters say there was no ceasefire, and the Turkish assault on Kurdish positions has never stopped. For the latest on this developing situation, we are joined by VOA Middle East correspondent Heather Murdoch. She joins us by Skype from a Syrian city near the border with Turkey. Thank you for joining us, Heather. And Heather, what can you tell me about what's going on there?
Well, last night it was expected here that there might be a renewal of the assaults on the Kurdish region of Syria, but apparently the Turks, the Russians, and the Syrian government made a deal. So today there is no bombing here, and things are quiet, but the mood is very uncertain. People don't know who's going to be in charge of the various towns and cities and villages along the border by tomorrow, by next week, or by next month.
All right. Are there refugees? Are the Kurds leaving that area? And if so, where are they going?
Well, in the past 10 days, there have been 200,000 people that have fled their homes. So there are places that have been evacuated. But these are people from a city that would eventually like to go back. Right now, they're afraid to go back because it is being controlled by Turkish-backed fighters that they fear. In terms of refugees coming into this area, we don't know what's going to happen with that because that movement has not started. Right now, people are still fleeing the area.
Heather, I've been in Iraq where the refugees from Syria over the course of the past 10 years in the civil war, they have flowed into Iraq, and the conditions are absolutely deplorable. The weather is cold. It's just terrible. Their food, they have nothing left on their, they have nothing, but they left with whatever they could carry. Is that the situation that you are beginning to see, or is it different?
It's already happening, and what you described is very accurate, but here at this moment, it's actually worse here because a lot of the places where people who fled their homes are staying are irregular camps with very little support from NGOs and government. As you may know, all of the foreign aid staff fled this country more than a week ago. So they are short all sorts of supplies and have very little way of building a support network for the new wave of refugees over the past few days and week.
What is the, so if you can generalize it, what's sort of the civilian view, the civilian Kurdish view of the United States and the fact that the troops have left there?
We've been talking to people every day for more than a week now about this exact issue, and people pretty much speak in unison. They feel betrayed, abandoned, and they are distraught. They feel like they are afraid of the Russian influence. Nobody really knows here what Russian influence will look like on the ground at this point. But American support was very helpful to the Kurdish people, and it helped them grow strong and, as you know, defeat Islamic State militants. But with this sudden withdrawal, they've lost a tremendous amount of territory. Hundreds of people have died. A lot of people have been displaced, and it appears now that some of their land is permanently out of the hands of the government that they view as their self-determined government.
Explain to me, if you will, in the beginning, beginning in August, there was discussion about a 9-mile sort of buffer zone that Turkey wanted into Syria to protect them from what they said are terrorists. All of a sudden, it extended to 20. What happened?
Well, this was something that was very surprising to everyone here because they did agree to this smaller buffer zone. The Kurdish-led forces pulled their weapons out, pulled down their defenses, thinking that this would allow the area to stay at peace because Turkey would not feel like they needed to attack if there was some space between them. Then suddenly the U.S. declared that they were withdrawing, and Turkey around the same time has said what they have maintained before, that they need a much larger area between them and the Kurdish military forces. So what has happened is the Kurds have tried to defend this area after the U.S. Pulled out suddenly, but they can't defend themselves against fighter jets and the second largest army in NATO.
You've been on the ground there for a long time. You've been covering this for VOA for so long. Anything sort of surprise you as to what's going on, or anything out of the ordinary, besides, of course, that there is the end of this, there's fighting?
Well, one thing that has surprised me, although maybe it shouldn't, is that people here still have some kind of hope. It appears that the Kurdistan region of Syria is dissolving, and their semi-autonomy is going away overnight as the Syrian government comes in with Russian support. But people here are still saying that they hope that they can come back from this and continue self-rule. But they do say very clearly that they're not sure that's possible unless another kind of international force comes back to them.
Heather, thank you. Heather Murdoch, VOA Middle East correspondent. The plight of the Kurds is one that is a century old. It involves different Kurdish factions living in 4 different countries. The crisis is extremely complex, but at the center of it all is the question of statehood for the Kurds. VOA Steve Reddish has our report.
Kurdish population estimates range between 30 and 35 million people, mostly living in the mountainous regions of Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria, with some in Armenia as well. Most Kurds are Sunni Muslims. With a rich mixture of Persian, Turkic, and Arabic ethnicities, language diversity and tolerance distinguish Kurdish culture. The Kurdish people have long desired to have a country they can call their own. There are different factions of Kurds, and their objectives vary. Some want statehood, while others want to gain more rights in the countries they already live. Only the Kurds in Iraq have an internationally recognized semi-autonomous region. The Iraqi Kurds overwhelmingly voted for independence in 2017, but their most recent effort to create a state was crushed by the Iraqi government. After World War I and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the 1920 Treaty of Sèvres promised the Kurds a state. That promise was never fulfilled, as modern-day Turkey was founded in 1923 by the Treaty of Lausanne. Some refer to the Kurds as the largest ethnic group without a state. They remain a minority group in authoritarian countries who have, at times, faced severe crackdowns from governments who see them as a threat.
Far from being a homogenous population, the estimated 30 to 35 million Kurds who live along the borders of Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria are actually a very large and diverse group of people. They share a common history, a common language, and a strong desire to establish a homeland. Mutlu Siviroglu is a journalist with VOA's Kurdish language service and an expert in Syrian and Kurdish affairs. He spoke with Plugged In's Mil Arsega about the Kurdish struggle for independence.
So, yes, they are not monolithic. They have linguistic differences. They have tribal differences. Mm-hmm. Yes, in each part of what Kurds call Kurdistan, the dynamics are different. The relation with the central government is different. But they have a common identity. They call themselves Kurds. They call their homeland Kurdistan because the circumstances in each part of Kurdistan is different. So the Kurds of Turkey dropped the demand for independence around 15, 20 years ago. And Kurds of Syria, they never they never sought independent Kurdistan. They want a decentralized Syria where Kurds and other ethnic and religious minorities can live together. Like you say, they have Western values. They want to be part of the West. That's why Kurds of Syria, for example, they chose US over Russia. And that's what this disaster is happening to them. Because Russia believes that Kurds need a lesson. Because they chose the US over them. Because, as you know, Russia is a traditional ally of Bashar Assad, Syrian president. So, and many Kurds believe it's the green light from Putin as well caused Erdogan to attack Kurds, because he feels the more Kurds of Syria gets power, they get status, the Kurds in Turkey will demand similar things. So Kurds, in a way, paying the price of being pro-Western.
Are you surprised that Kurds are not receiving more international support towards building their own country, their own independent country in a land that is in desperate need of democratic principles?
I'm certainly disappointed. I'm certainly believe Kurds deserve more, because it's in the benefit of the West too. To support people that share their values, people that treat different ethnic and religious groups not as a threat, but as a richness. But when you look to the support for the Kurds, it's very minimal.
I wonder what your thoughts were when you heard the president comparing what was going on there in Syria to kids in a playground fighting for their toys.
As a journalist, as an American, I took it very hard, honestly, because we're talking about the lives of people. This is not a game for kids. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. People are forced to leave, and looting, killing, execution, and the streets are full of bodies. This is what's going on now.
So you're suggesting that the U.S. administration's decision to pull its troops out of Syria is already backfiring?
Certainly, it's already backfiring, and I'm afraid it's going to get worse. First of all, for the people of the region, because they are displaced now. You cannot solve a refugee problem by creating new refugees, by expelling people from their homes, by making them, miserable, by causing their death. This is not a solution. With all due respect, President Trump promises to end wars, but it's not going to end wars. This is going to make it even longer and longer, and also the credibility of the U.S.
is at stake.
Is certainly at stake. So Kurds have stood with U.S. They lost a lot of their brave men and women. Now U.S. is abandoning them. We had a report at VOA a few days ago. South Koreans are starting to worry. Our allies are starting to worry that, are we going to be the next? U.S. cannot afford abandoning their allies.
Look, every crisis presents an opportunity. The fact of the matter is people are talking about the Kurdish situation today. Do you see perhaps some light at the end of the tunnel here, that perhaps the world will be talking about the plight of Kurds as a result of what we're seeing today?
I like to be optimistic. I am always an optimistic individual. As at the moment, there are my relatives, their life is at stake, because I have immediate relatives there. I have hundreds of friends calling me every day.
It's personal.
It's personal, to asking a glimpse of hope that Mr. President is going to change, is going to realize that maybe he was a good intention, but the outcome is different.
What do you want our audience to know about the Kurdish situation?
I want them to know that yes, they share similar values, like our audience. They embrace diversity. They respect the people's identity, people's faith, people's religion. If the world is secure today, it's thanks to Kurdish men and women, And my hope is that they're going to remember this, and they're not going to let, especially Kurds in Syria, to be killed or to be, massacred, displaced, and because they caused the hope when the world was most gloomy, most pessimistic from ISIS. It was the little Kurdish town Kobani became the hope, and they defeated. That was for you, for me, for everybody. That defeat, they paid the price for all of us, and it is time for people to stand with Kurds.
So far, more than 12,000 Kurdish fighters have died in the U.S.-led war on terror. And now the questions. Are we less secure now that American troops are leaving Syria, or more secure? And will the Kurdish people ever get the support they need to establish their own state? To help us answer these questions, I'm joined by VOA National Security Correspondent Jeff Zeldin and Habib Ali Kozai from VOA's Extreme and Watch Desk. Welcome, gentlemen. And first, let me go to you, Jeff. ISIS, after what's happened in the last 2 weeks, is it thought that ISIS is going to regenerate itself, so we're less secure?
Well, military and intelligence officials in the U.S. have said already that ISIS has been resurging both in Iraq and in Syria. And intelligence officials, counterterrorism officials worry that this will just give them more opportunities to take advantage of divisions, of chaos, of the different movements of troops. And the other problem is figuring out what ISIS is going to do next. How these terrorists are going to take advantage of the situation is going to be more difficult because as you have fewer U.S. boots on the ground, fewer U.S. troops in Syria, fewer people to work with the SDF and other allies on the ground to figure out what's going on. And that makes the ISR, the drones that you can fly, the planes you can put in the air to watch from above, that much less effective. And again, Islamic State is very skilled and very experienced in using chaos, divisions, and uncertainty to its advantage. And they've seen this before from the U.S. Remember, Islamic State came out of Al-Qaeda of Iraq, which went through something similar back in around 2006.
You know, Hasib, one thing that nobody's talked about in the last several months is the fact that al-Baghdadi, who is the head of ISIS, he released a video, I think, last April. So the head, the inspiration, is still alive.
It very well is, and he has actually asked his supporters to kind of go back to an insurgency versus controlling large swaths of territory in those countries. But to put a light on the Kurdish issue there, you know, history is kind of very important here. They have always tried at creating a state of their own. Their aspirations have been crushed a number of times. They're essentially a victim of geography. They're among very strong states. You know, you have Turkey there, or former strong states. You have Syria, you have Iraq, you have Iran. And their most recent effort at creating a state was crushed in 2017 by the Iraqi security forces. One thing that's important about the Turkish Kurds, they're the most organized, politically active. And Turkey has always been scared of those Kurds that they will eventually separate and create a state of their own. Now, next to
I mean, I was in Iraq, and I actually went to the Kurdish cemetery where you see such evidence of the Kurdish slaughter and how the Kurds have been treated in that area. I mean, they really are in the most unfortunate situation geographically.
Absolutely.
But I mean, it's like, you know, history is so important here to see. It's not just the last 2 weeks. It is what has happened to the Kurds in recent history, in the last 30, 40 years.
Absolutely. Saddam Hussein went after them and in the 80s and 90s, and they have been in a very hostile geography to begin with. They were promised a state after the fall of the Ottoman Empire in First World War, and with the creation of modern-day Turkey in 1923. Turkey was not even admitting to their identity. They started a process called Turkification, and they were even calling them mountain Turks instead of calling them Kurds. So they've always struggled so their demands have changed over time. From, you know, at times they wanted more autonomy, and at times they wanted a state of their own. But the Syrian Kurds.
But I don't get that their demands have changed so much. I think that they wanted the original to have their own state, their own land, and then when that was taken away from them, then they sort of want to exist as they're being slaughtered. I mean, it's not. I mean, they are just.
They're adjusting to reality.
They're adjusting to reality.
This is also bigger, though, than just the Kurds. Western intelligence officials have said for years now, not only is what's going on in the Middle East the most complicated conundrum that they've faced in their careers, but that for years, the Middle East has started rewriting itself. You can look at the Arab Spring, but there were a lot of lines, boundaries that were drawn post-World War I, post-World War II, and the Middle East, the people are rising up, they're rejecting a lot of those boundaries, and they're trying to rewrite that. And at the same time now, you have powers like Iran trying to exert their influence on how those lines are being redrawn. You have Russia, which under the U.S. defense strategy is one of the two prime U.S. adversaries in the world, and the U.S. says it's trying to rewrite the global world order established post-World War II. Russia is now very active trying to influence how the lines are being drawn in this region, where not only has Russia just brokered a ceasefire agreement with Turkey, but they've also been dealing directly with the SDF and the Kurds and playing both sides of the issue. So as complex as this situation was just a few months ago, it's even more complicated now.
And I might add that, I mean, it's, you know, the president has said this about the Kurds, and of course this is Erdogan's view as well about some of the Kurds. This is a very diverse group, but let's listen to what the president said.
Our soldiers are not in harm's way, as they shouldn't be, as two countries fight over land. That has nothing to do with us. And the Kurds are much safer right now, but the Kurds know how to fight. And as I said, they're not angels. They're not angels.
Hasib, if you think of the Kurds as one group, but they're not one group. I mean, you've got the slaughter in Iraq that I've witnessed. I've been to the cemeteries. I just noted. But in Turkey, they set off bombs. I mean, so that's why they're seen as terrorists within Turkey.
In fairness to what the president said, when he calls them, they are not angels either. He's basically referring to, and I think this goes back to the Obama administration, where they made an alliance and they didn't draw red lines for the Syrian Democratic Forces at the time. There is an element within the Syrian Democratic Forces called the People's Protection Unit, or the YPG, and it's alleged that YPG has ties to the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which is called PKK, and it's a US, EU, and Turkey designated terror group. So that's what he refers to. And I think the U.S. at some point could have drawn those lines better and could have given them heads up that we are going to be allied with you as well as with our NATO ally Turkey, but you should sever your ties with PKK.
And the bottom line is that Kurds is one word, but there's a huge diverse group of people within Kurds with very different ideas as to what to do. Anyway,
Absolutely.
Gentlemen, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
This crisis involving the Kurds is multi-layered, whether referring to the current situation as a ceasefire or a pause. The international community is watching. Reaction to Turkey's initial military offensive was swift. Turkey's military operation causes unacceptable human suffering, according to a European Union statement condemning the attack. The EU says it threatens European security. France's President Emmanuel Macron said he, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and German Chancellor Angela Merkel plan to meet with Turkey's President Erdogan in the coming weeks. The response from Russian President Vladimir Putin was more measured, saying he's not sure that Turkey could prevent the escape of ISIS prisoners if it resumes its offensive against Kurdish forces. Before the ceasefire, Erdogan said Turkish troops are not targeting Kurdish citizens, only the Syrian Kurdish fighters it views as terrorists. The United States has been accused of abandoning the Syrian Kurds, a policy mistake, some say, that could haunt the U.S. in its future dealings with our allies. But according to our next guest, this is not necessarily true. Joining us by Skype with more on how the U.S. pullout from Syria is likely to play out on the world stage is retired American diplomat Robert Ford, who served as the U.S. ambassador to Syria from 2010 to 2014. Yeah, welcome, Ambassador. And let me go first to the question of President Trump's decision to move the troops out of Syria. Was that a wise decision?
I think it's the right policy thrust. I agree with where he's trying to go. The way it was implemented was mediocre at best. There was no reason to surprise our Kurdish partners. There was no reason to surprise American diplomats and American soldiers on the ground. That was poorly done. But I agree with the president when he said there's an argument about land which doesn't really concern the United States.
Do you think Turkey, and obviously this is if we all have a crystal ball or imaginings, but do you think that Erdogan would have had that military movement into Syria if the U.S. forces were there? And I realize we don't leave our U.S. forces there to be killed, but does it seem possible that Erdogan would have held himself off?
No, I don't think he would have attacked and risked American casualties. The American Air Force is flying in the skies up above, and the Turks do not want to challenge the American Air Force for understandable reasons. So it's a different question as to how long the American forces would have been there and what was their mission. Remember, when all of this started, the mission of the American forces was to destroy ISIS. And somehow, during the course of 5 years, that objective evolved, changed to protecting the Syrian Kurdish-led mini-state that was being established in northeastern Syria.
What happens now that the U.S. is sort of out of the picture? Russia has now moved in, and Putin and Erdogan have struck what appears to be a deal. But it seems rather peculiar in many ways because Turkey is our NATO ally, and now Putin is moving into the area. We have, oddly enough, or not oddly enough, but historically, nuclear weapons in Turkey. So can you tell me what to expect in the next few weeks and months?
I think what you'll see are two things happening. Number one, under Russian patronage, the Syrian government will slowly begin to reestablish its authority over large segments of northeastern Syria. And elements of that mini-state, which I referred to, led by Syrian Kurdish forces, will begin to disappear. That will be gradual, but the Russians have always been very clear that they support the Syrian government in its efforts to reassert control over all of Syria. The second thing that will happen, I believe, is that the Turks will then have to look at making concessions to the Russians, most likely in the northwestern part of Syria, and we will probably see an escalation in fighting in the northwestern part of Syria called Idlib, where there are approximately 3 million civilians.
All right, now I don't know if I misspoke, that those nuclear weapons I referenced, those are U.S. nuclear weapons that are in Turkey, and that was just sort of an aside.
Right.
Let me turn now to the question, if I may. You have met with President Assad of Syria. What is he like?
Mm-hmm. What's he like? Well, he's personable when you talk to him one-to-one. I met him twice. He's fluent in English. He's approachable. He's not stuffy. He's relatively informal and relaxed. But that said, I also found in meetings with him that he would lie directly to my face. And I've met at least half a dozen leaders in countries like Algeria and Iraq, Bahrain, Egypt, and I never before had seen a regional leader lie directly to my face when he knew that I knew he was lying. And that suggests to me that Bashar al-Assad has a weak personality, doesn't like face-to-face argument and confrontation.
What happens now with the U.S.? What's the U.S.'s reputation in the world, if anything? Does it change at all that the U.S. has seemingly backed away from the Kurds? And this is not the first time that the U.S. has been accused of abandoning the Kurds, historically.
Well, we have abandoned the Kurds previously, during the time of Henry Kissinger, most notably, when the governments of Iran and Iraq reached a territorial agreement and the Americans suddenly shut off their assistance to the father of the previous Iraqi Kurdish regional government in Iraq, Masoud Barzani's father, Mustafa, who died in exile in the United States. I do not think this is going to damage American credibility worldwide over the medium or long term. I don't think we're going to see countries like South Korea suddenly doubt whether or not the United States is reliable. South Korea will judge American reliability not on the Kurds, but rather on what we do with North Korea. Japan will judge American reliability and credibility on what we do with China and North Korea, not with what we do with the Kurds. The Saudi Arabians, states in the Gulf, will judge our reliability and credibility based on what we do with Iran, not the Kurds.
Ambassador, thank you very much. Robert Ford, former ambassador to Syria. And before we go, some closing thoughts on democratic reforms in a region that has seen precious little. Remember the Arab Spring? The anti-government protests that quickly spread across North Africa and the Middle East? Those protests were sparked in 2011 by the death of a Tunisian street vendor. And it appears Tunisia again has provided a spark, this time, though, for democracy, following the landslide victory of newly elected President Kais Saied. The 61-year-old former professor, who has no previous political experience, campaigned door-to-door and wowed audiences in live U.S.-style presidential debates. He won the support of 90% of the country's youth by vowing to fight corruption and promising to uphold their constitution. Of course, the Tunisian election may turn out to be a fluke, but it also may be a sign that Tunisia is setting new trends again and perhaps setting the stage for the return of governments that hold themselves accountable to the people who put them in power. We'll see you next week.